So welcome to the August Club night. So before I hand over to Birgita, I'm just going to introduce her for you. So Birgita is a senior research fellow in the Centre for eResearch and Digital Innovation at Federation University, and she manages research projects relating to citizen science, natural resource management, and digital agriculture. So her primary research focuses on the conservation of shorebirds, waterbirds, and their wetland habitats, with a growing emphasis on achieving conservation outcomes through technology enablement. So Birgita is on the Birdlife Australia Research and Conservation Committee, and he's also the chair of the Australasian Wader Studies Group and the Australasian representative to the International Wader Study Group. So Birgita is leading the Latham Snipe project, which I'm sure we're going to hear a bit about tonight, which is a national citizen science project investigating the movement patterns and the habitat use of Latham snipe. So to hear more about Latham snipe, their movements and their ecology, I'm going to hand over to Birgita now.
Thanks heaps, Louise, for the introduction. And I'd just like to thank you all for having me along tonight. I actually just want to start this by acknowledging the people in your region and Hunter Bird Observers Club who've been contributing to this project since 2017. And the enormous effort people have put in to, bring in some really great data on the snipe population in the Newcastle region. And I also want to acknowledge at least one person I know who's passed away who was contributing to that effort, Peter Weinstock. So look, thank you all. Some of you might be in the audience tonight and some of you might have heard this talk before. And hopefully there's some new insights in there for you. So just quick background, which probably most of you are all really familiar with, is that, we're in the East Asian Australasian flyway, and shorebirds are a really big part of this flyway. There's 37 species in Australia that breed predominantly in the northern hemisphere and migrate to Australia, and because of that migratory behaviour, moving through many different countries, they're a real management challenge. And so we've got a number of agreements and treaties which are really designed to try and place those obligations on governments to try and manage these species and protect their habitats. The Ramsar Convention, of course, being one of the oldest and most probably widespread of them all. In Australia, we're a party to 3 national agreements with other national governments. And the one, of course, I'm always most interested in is the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, which was ratified in 1981 and was driven very strongly by snipe as a shared species of concern. Of course, in Australia, mechanisms to protect and manage our species is the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. One question, how well that achieves its aims, which is supposed to be helping reduce impacts of development on matters of national environmental significance. So shorebirds are collectively listed as one of those matters, and then threatened species are listed in their own right. So there's a whole lot of those matters of national environmental significance, and up until not so long ago, Latham snipe was only listed as a migratory shorebird and didn't have any status on its own. Significant impact thresholds relate back to those, essentially the Ramsar criterion. So for our purposes here in Australia, if a site supports more than 0.1% of a global population or the flyway population of the species, then it meets the criteria under the Act for nationally important habitat. We don't need to talk about population estimate revisions. We don't need to talk about the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, but we can point out that as a consequence of their revision in 2023, Latham snipe was uplisted to vulnerable in 2024 January, which is really sort of great and terrible. It's great that the species gets the recognition, and it's terrible that we're in that state. So these are the 3 species we have in Australia, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And if you aren't, well, you're probably only very familiar with Latham snipe because it's the only one that occurs predominantly on the east coast. And it's got the most restricted range of the 3 species. So there's some overlap with swinhose snipe here in Queensland. And occasionally the 2 species can stray down into eastern Australia. So there was a pin-tailed snipe record in the ACT a couple of years ago, picked up on call because, of course, you can't identify them really reliably in the field without usually catching them. But the interesting thing, I suppose, with Latham snipe is that it's not only is its range probably is the smallest of the 3, but it's the only one that really does these big over ocean flights, whereas the other 2 species are probably, land hopping or doing short flights over the sea to get between their breeding and non-breeding grounds. And that seems to be a bit of a unique thing for snipe in the Gallinago genus. So they breed mostly in Japan. In fact, they're probably mostly northern Japan now in Hokkaido. The breeding range has really contracted over time. So they used to breed all the way through Honshu. They also breed in Sakhalin Island, which I'll talk a bit more about later. And their non-breeding distribution is essentially Eastern Australia with some vagrant records elsewhere. In Australia, it's really cryptic, of course, as we know, and it prefers to roost in shallow vegetated wetlands during the day, but at night, it'll actually go out and feed out in quite open areas. And you've had some great records from, I think it's Ash Island, where the birds have been seen out foraging in the day. So they will do that sometimes when the conditions are really good. And there's a real difference between the habitats in the two countries. I mean, it's almost like they're different species sometimes, especially when you see them on the breeding grounds and you see the habitats they use, not really typically wetlands, except when they're aggregating or bottlenecking prior to migration. But they tend to use woodland and meadowland, whereas they really are a wetland species in Australia. And the population estimate still sits around 35,000, hasn't really changed from the original estimate done back in the 1980s. So this is just sort of a snapshot, really, of some of these locations where the birds occur. I should really have put pictures of Newcastle here. That was a bit remiss of me. Sorry about that. These are from Ballarat, showing really classic roosting habitat in Ballarat. So they often like this rocky stuff. We'll find them in these short vegetation around rocks or out on little islands like this, or they'll just be in this sort of scrappy, thickly vegetated wetlands. They obviously also occur outside urban areas, but we do tend to find these aggregations in these little scrappy urban wetlands. So it's down here. And then these two photos are from the north of their distribution. So this one here is right at the top of Hokkaido, right up here opposite Mount Rishiri, which is this island, this volcanic island. And when I said they don't usually use wetlands, I perhaps extended my truth a little bit there. This is Sarabetsu Marsh, where the birds breed. And yes, there's water there, but the birds are probably, spending all their time in the more sort of scrappy grassland, shrubby stuff. And then this is Sakhalin here. This is actually paddocks used for cattle grazing, and they like this really scrappy stuff at the edge of the woodland there. So quite different types of habitats in those two extreme ends of the range. So threats to snipe were historically sport shooting, and they were a very popular game bird. New South Wales actually stopped the season on snipe hunting before the other states did. It was one of the earliest, I think, in Queensland. Good old Victoria was still shooting them right up into 1983. This photo is taken from Leongatha. But since the close on hunting in 1983 in Victoria, and that was the last state to finish hunting, you could say that it's not really an issue these days for this species. There is a little bit of illegal shooting that goes on, but it's probably negligible. And really the biggest threats for this species are land use change and habitat loss. And in Australia, of course, that wetland habitat loss is a really big one through development. But also in Japan, there's, agricultural intensification there. There's conversion of meadowlands to solar farms. So, there's a huge range of threats that are largely related to habitat loss. And it would be fair to say that even when they were hunted, they were still experiencing loss of habitat and drying of wetlands and draining. So this sort of had a bit of a double whammy. And I'm not really sure that the species has ever quite recovered from both hunting and habitat loss. And so, it's one of the key threats listed in the action plan. The breeding population's thought to be declining in Hokkaido. They had a big drop in numbers in 2020, which they attributed to potential bushfire impacts. It's a bit hard to say because the survey effort was a partial rather than all their sites, but they certainly had a huge drop, about 40%. So, it indicates there's some issues somewhere in their flyway. So this is, of course, what they look like in Australia. That's taken at Jerrabomberra wetlands. Hopefully you can all see little snipe there in the grass. And then that's what they look like in Japan and Russia. So the methods we use to monitor this species is really completely different in the two countries, and it means that we've had to really try and tackle monitoring this species a bit differently to other shorebirds, because you just won't generally reliably detect them just by using point counts or spotting scopes. You actually got to go and shift them out of their vegetation to get a sense of how many are there. This project has a long history that started with a legal dispute, and I don't really want to go into all of that now. Some of you have probably heard that before, but it really led to me thinking about these questions that we have about this species. And, it's quite different to other shorebirds. And for a long time, we really didn't know a huge amount about it compared to other shorebirds. We're not picking it up in typical shorebird surveys. So it was really about, well, let's try and understand more about their contemporary abundance and distribution. And importantly, try and identify, what's important habitat or critical habitat to support the species, because we didn't really have a good sense of that, despite the excellent work done by Hansen in the 80s. So yes, this started around a legal case, and it led to a monitoring program, which was really trying to address some questions about the population size, how it changes over time, what the trends are. I mean, that's still a question mark. We've been 10 years in now. This is the 10th year of this program, and we still can't answer a question about population trends. Important sites on migration, what are the routes they use, what are the habitats they rely upon in Australia. There's lots and lots of elements to this project, so I won't go through them all in a lot of detail, except to say that the big ones really are, I'm just going to put the pointer on here. Just give me a moment. There we are. The big ones really, especially that the Hunter Bird Observers Club has contributed to, is the observational surveys to do the population monitoring. And then we've done a lot of work, movement tracking, which is continuing. But there's policy analysis, social research, engagement of community and children, visits to Japan, a lot of activities going on. I've got 2 students at the moment, and it's just really exciting to see lots of people, working on this species with me, and also doing their own work on the species too in Japan and elsewhere in Australia. So the surveys, I'll give you a quick overview on those first. So we started those in 2014, 2015 in Port Fairy, and extended them in the following year to other parts of Victoria, and ultimately we have extended them across their eastern range. So this map, black dots just show where most of the sites are. It's a little bit out of date, and the blue triangles are just records from the ALA that I've curated. And we do our surveys using these flushing transects. So as I was saying, you can't reliably estimate abundance using point surveys. So unfortunately, you do need to flush the birds. And it was the method that was used for a very long time. During Hansen surveys, they used to do that with a rope or even with dogs. So we've continued this method where we just, the team can spread out and walk through the wetland, or it can be an individual, and then we can determine roughly what area we've covered based on the route that people take. We do 3 surveys a season. I've written there that we have 380 sites counted with about 100 to 150 done regularly. It's probably slightly more than that these days, but probably about half of them get counted every survey. And there's a big volunteer effort behind this. And some people have been doing it year after year, like many people in the Newcastle region, and others just sort of pop in and out when they can. So it's been really valuable. This is just a snapshot of the data overall. The black bars show the total abundance in each one of those seasonal counts. So this is September 2015 on the left up to the January count that we just had. And the biggest count we had was in November 2021. We had nearly 2,000 birds across 120 sites. So the green line shows the number of or reporting areas, as I call them. I won't go into how those are defined, but they're an aggregation based on spatial proximity. And perhaps not surprisingly, we see as count efforts increased over time, the number of birds has increased, and there's been a drop-off in recent years, which is sort of curious because, these have been these wet La Nina years down here in southern Australia up until the start of last year, and yet the numbers sort of tailored off a little bit. So that could reflect the fact that some areas have been drier and have had quite a few birds in them, and then other areas have been very, very wet. Like the number of times people have sent me their surveys from Newcastle region, there's too much water, it was too wet, and there was no margins. That could be part of the issue. And then these tiny little red bars down here is the total count from the Newcastle region. And again, there was this big spike of birds in November 2021. And this little red arrow here just shows when Newcastle came into the program, and this is when it extended across the whole country. So there's a fair bit of effort there that's gone into that. Oh, yes, I've said that. One of the things I was talking about the EPBC Act, and one of the things I think is really important for this, well, for all species, but for this species in particular, is to understand where these sites are that support significant aggregations of birds. And so under the Act, it's still 18 birds, it's still the threshold for nationally important habitat. And I think it's really important that we understand, well, where are they and how often do birds use them and what are the characteristics of them? And since we've started the program, we've now documented about 75 sites that meet that threshold of 18 or more birds. Some of them only meet it once, but there's a lot of sites that meet it more often than that. And then out of those, there's at least 20 sites that regularly support more than 80 snipe. So, I mean, once upon a time, 80 was probably nothing, back in the days of when Pambalong Reserve was at its height, you were getting 400 to 500 snipe there, but we just don't get numbers like that anymore. So a population size over 80 is actually pretty good. And I've done a bit of an analysis on where do these sites occur in terms of land use, and perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of them are in urban areas because that's where people surveying. We do have a lot of sites outside urban areas, but there's a bit of a bias towards urban areas. But nevertheless, most of these sites are in urban, so there's actually more of a skew towards nationally important sites or sites where snipe are aggregating being in urban areas. And then the disturbing thing is that most of those sites have no formal protection at all. So I will show you some data from Newcastle. So there are 7. So here's a map you'll all be very familiar with here. So a bit of a cluster of sites across this region. Some counted irregularly and some counted quite frequently. There's 7 that meet that threshold. So I've just listed them down here. So Newcastle waters and Shortland waters, Newcastle wetlands are actually a grouped site, so they're a reporting area because of their proximity. The 2 wetlands, Bulbul Crescent, Keckle Street, are also grouped because we know birds move between those. The ponds around Bunnings and Wallsend are another site. Stockton Borehole, Cliftley Meadows Park, Irrawang Swamp, which actually hasn't had any survey effort for a while, and Chisholm Wetlands, which is quite big. That actually contains quite a few small snipe sites. All those sites have met that threshold. And in the case of the ones at the top here, Shortland / Newcastle, Bulbul Crescent, Keckle, they've actually exceeded the threshold on quite a few times. So about 40% of surveys they've exceeded those thresholds. And we had that nice big count of 205 birds at that site in November 2021. And disturbingly, when we look at the protected area, National Protected Areas database, none of those sites protected. I think Bulbul Crescent and Keckle Street come up gazettal in progress. So the words have been, I don't actually know what NRS means. I can't remember. Maybe someone in the audience does. So that must relate to Hexham Swamp. But that was as of 2024. So it's a bit hard to know if that means there's any protections. I'd say with the proximity to those urban areas, probably none. So it's just this pattern that's emerging from the monitoring is that we're getting these sites that are really important for snipe, and they've often got a lot of snipe there, and they're often in areas of high human habitation, and they have no protection. They're falling outside the National Reserve Network. Just one little quick thing we have done from the project that sort of deviates a bit from just the monitoring and abundance data, and that is looking at the flight initiation distance data. So because especially in the early days, we were fairly rigorous about how we did our flushing surveys, and we would estimate the distance between the observer and the birds when they flushed. And so we got a lot of records. Some people still do it, and they do it repeatedly, so they're fairly experienced at it now. And I did an analysis with Mike Weston at Deakin Uni of those data. We had to trim it back a little bit to keep stuff that was consistent and that we knew that had been estimated fairly reliably. And we've been able to use those data in an analysis to determine disturbance buffer width recommendations, which is particularly important in these urban areas. Like one of the things that, of course, we know when you've got snipe in these small wetlands, they can potentially be quite easily disturbed if there's people too close. So, what are those recommendations we can provide to managers based on the data we're collecting from this project in terms of, augmenting or rehabbing or creating new wetland habitats? And this graph's just showing some of the data from across a range of sites. The blue bars are urban sites and the orange bars are non-urban, so not a huge difference in the distance birds flush in those two habitat types. And we use those data to come up with widths of 75 to 110 metres, which is, it gives people a bit of a range, so that would prevent 80 to 95% of vigilance responses. Now, I can imagine that you're all sitting there like scratching your heads in the audience, thinking about your little local wetland that's about 75 metres wide. It's up to the land manager ultimately to make the decision about how much land they're going to sacrifice and how much area they've got. So it's a starting point. It's gone into the Snipe guidelines, and we hope that we can, improve that over time. So on to the tracking stuff. It's usually the bit people are always more interested in. And it's certainly been an exciting but challenging road for us with this species, because when we started tracking back in 2015, there weren't devices suitable for this species because they were still too big. So we started off just the old leg bands, leg flags. As the Japanese were doing the same thing there. That's a Japanese flag bird. We have the orange in Victoria or in Southeast, Victoria and ACT. And we were using light level geolocators initially to try and get those long distance migration tracks. And eventually we moved to a range of satellite and GPS transmitters. So we tried the solar microwave telemetry platform transmitter terminals with not very much success. And then we moved on to non-solar GPS devices for a while, made by Latham, which were better in terms of positional accuracy, but they're still, probably a little bit heavier than we would like, around 4.2 grams. And we also did some radio tracking in the early days. It's been really funny to see that when we started this project, radio tracking was still a thing you would do, with the antenna, the manual exercise, on small shorebirds, small to medium shorebirds. And now 10 years on, you just probably wouldn't waste your time now because there's just so many better technologies. So we got 2 geolocators back from 40 we deployed. So, they gave us this amazing data, but, it was a huge amount of effort for not a huge amount of return. So we didn't make any more attempts after we had deployed those geolocators in Port Fairy, so down here in southwest Victoria, and then in Canberra. But the first one was the one that we talked about everywhere, because it was, the mind-blowing big excitement that the first snipe we ever caught was the first snipe we ever recaptured exactly 12 months later in exactly the same spot, like even in the same patch of wetland. And it was this bird, this female that flew to southern Hokkaido via Cape York and bred in southern Hokkaido and did that monstrous flight back over the Pacific in 3 days. And it's been interesting because we haven't had other birds that we could tell that moved as fast. So I assumed at the time, I don't know if any of you were following the grey plover tracking at the time, but around the time they had a couple of grey plover coming back and they hit a cyclone, and I can't remember what happened. Maybe they got shoofed off over the Pacific or turned around and went back. But, it was around the same time that this snipe left. And so I just assumed it had a, significant tailwind assist, because its average speed was about 97 kilometres an hour for 3 days, which just seemed quite remarkable. That's an average, obviously, because geolocators don't give you exact positional data. But we have since had some additional data coming through from some other tag snipe that also has some really, really high speeds. So I'm looking into analysing that at the moment, because they're much higher than I've seen in any other shorebird species. So it'll be interesting to see what we get out of that analysis. And this figure here just shows the light data from the geolocator. And, you get these little step changes. So this is sunset and this is sunrise here, and then that's the date along the bottom, which I don't expect you to read. And you can see as the bird shifts its latitude, longitude, the day length is changing, and then you get these little step changes where the bird's made a flight, and then you get this stippling, which is caused when the bird sits on the geolocator and smothers the light sensor. And so you can infer incubation of eggs there, which is pretty cool. And that's where geolocators are superior to any other device. You just can't get that off other devices. And then our second bird, which we caught in Canberra, it's not as nice a figure, I'm afraid. I don't have Simeon's skills at doing figures like that. But it sort of did a similar thing. It went up straight across the Pacific. This one went right to the top of Japan and then came back down through PNG. So we're pretty excited about that. There was evidence in both birds of staging in Queensland, which I was also very excited about. So a big debate with my colleague at the time that they don't stage in Australia. And we had 2 months of staging in both birds. So that was kind of cool. So yeah, we had to go at these platform transmitter terminals, which the Japanese, we went and helped the Japanese with catching, and they put a few on themselves, and then we shifted to these non-solar devices. There's a bird wearing one there, and we deployed 6 of those in Canberra and got partial tracks from some of them. And then in the meantime, the Wild Bird Society of Japan did some more PTT deployments, but they had more money than us. So they were able to get those little 2-gram devices. And so they deployed some of those 2-gram devices with much greater success. So, I mean, it's just indicated that what we suspected, that it's just better to keep the weight down on these tags if you can. And then just very recently, we've started deploying these Druid Bluetooth GPS tags, which are not satellite transmitters. So the data transmission is through a local Bluetooth receiver, but they've been really successful. And this photo was taken in the height of the drought, whichever drought that might be. I can't even remember now, at Jerrabomberra wetlands in Canberra. It was the only time I ever got to catch snipe in my hiking boots, usually in waders. That was quite remarkable. So what I've got here is just a collection of data where we did get like a full migration track. And I will have to confess that 5 of these tracks are the Wild Bird Society of Japan tracks. So that was their little PTTs. They popped out up here in Hokkaido. So like this one here, it's come down to, I can't even see which track it is. It's come down across the Pacific. It's come down to this. Oh, this was the bird that hung out in Sydney. This bird hung out in Western Sydney parklands for like weeks and weeks and weeks, and then it left, and then they lost the track here somewhere. So I suspect probably the transmitter problem there. I very much doubt the bird went into the middle ocean. But and then the other 4 tracks are from these Druid tags. So I've actually just given away the end of the story at the start here, because I'll come to that. That's not what they were intended for. But we can just see, I just quite like this figure because you can see lots of direct over ocean flights here. You can see some birds are going down through it's too late in the evening. I can't remember the name of the island. Kyushu, I think it is, down the bottom there. And then coming up through Honshu, and then some birds stop in PNG and some stop in Cape York. And the overwintering Japanese snipe, yeah, so one was in Sydney. One spent the whole time in the ACT Alps, which was pretty cool. We went and tried to find it with no success. And then one was in this little locality called Nyangala, which is like near Tamworth. But I can't even, it's over here somewhere. And it was like in a sheep paddock or something for months. And it looks like some other birds. One bird went to Corner Inlet. One was near West Wyalong. So there are birds that are going into really heavily agricultural areas. And then of those GPS tag birds, 2 of them actually went to suckle and to breed, which I will show you in a moment. So these figures just give you a little snapshot of the types of staging or stopover habitat the birds are using. And some of this is also from the tags where we got the partial tracks earlier in the project. So this is on southward migration. I was just saying that birds go through agricultural areas. They use these really intensively, irrigated or planted agricultural areas in different parts of Australia. And this was the one near West Wyalong. I think this is could be the Murrumbidgee or the Lachlan. Anyway, one of those systems down there. This one's come through Cape York, so that's up here. That's definitely not. It's definitely not that part of I got that wrong. I'm not sure where that is, maybe near Dubbo. But, we've got birds passing through Cape York and on Western Cape York too. And that's been really interesting because, traditionally the thought was that the birds that use the west side of Cape York are swinhoe snipe. We had a lot of birds going through Central and Cape York. And this is the kind of floodplain savanna habitat they use when they're stopping off. Here's one going back on northward migration. I mean, you can't see any water there because it's just a Google image, but presumably there was water running in these channels. One of the birds stopped in Guardia wetlands. In fact, we've had a couple stop in Guardia wetlands on northward migration. And when I say staging, I mean, a period of 2 weeks or more, as opposed to just a few days or a week. And then we've had birds stopping in PNG right up here in the highlands. Again, sort of dispensing some myths that, the only species that uses Papua New Guinea really is swinhoes, and that Lathams are rare. Goodness knows where someone got that idea from. They obviously never looked at a distribution map of the 2 species, because clearly Latham snipe do use Papua New Guinea, and a lot of them actually stop or stage there to and from Japan. And then another one went through the Mackay district which I assume is sugarcane, but you can see this highly modified landscape, and the bird was popping around amongst these different cultivated fields. So that was the data we've got across those tags, and so these Druid tags, which we've used recently, are part of Laurie Gould's PhD project in the ACT, and it was really about trying to understand how the snipe use that landscape, because it's such a heavily urbanised landscape, and they're all these birds in the Jerrabomberra wetlands. It's like, well, how do they move around that landscape? What's their patterns, their day and night patterns, etc. So we put out these tags, 20 in 2022, 2023, and another 20 a year later. We had really good return rates, about 75%. And your data, some of you might probably already be familiar with these tags, but you pop up a tower, which is a Bluetooth gateway, and it's got a range of about 800 metres. So you put it up somewhere high, which we did in the wetland. And you can pick up the birds as they're flying around past that tower. So if they stay in the area, you get data. If they depart the area, you lose it. But you can also pick them up on a mobile phone if you're close enough, which at Jerrabomberra wetlands you can get quite close. So it's all the volunteers going around with their phone apps, picking up snipe and sending their reports in. And so we got some amazing data out of that, and it was the data we were expecting, plus the data we weren't expecting, which, of course, like I said, I gave away the story. It was the migration data, because that's not what it was intended for. So this is what we were interested in understanding. When we capture birds down here in Kelly's Swamp, that's not Kelly's Swamp, that's Kelly's Swamp there, in the centre of the Jerrabomberra Wetlands complex, what are they doing? And the answer is they're going all over the shop. Like some of them go out here into these grazed, there's still part of the reserve there, go out there into these areas that's lightly grazed and quite muddy or grassy. This peninsula is quite grassy here. Some of them just stay in the little wetlands around the main wetland where we were catching and where they were roosting. Some go across here into the turf farm. There's a huge amount of use of the turf farm, and every year we've got birds going to the turf farm. So CanTurf, which is the company that owns it, they're kind of like a assistants now in looking out for snipe and reporting what they find there. And essentially, when I've mapped up the Jerrabomberra wetlands as an important snipe site, it includes the turf farm. It's essentially, this is all one site here for snipe, even though they move around. It's about 1 kilometre across there. And then some of them are going up here north of the airport, which was not a site we knew. And sometimes they might go there for a couple of nights, then come back. And then some birds will go further. So this figure here just shows the distance that different birds go. So this is 0 to 6 kilometres here. And this is the ID of each bird. And you can see most birds are probably going 1 to 2 kilometres. That's the 2 kilometre mark there. And they're doing that day and night, really, really predictable movements. But every now and again, someone goes on a little wander and heads out a bit further afield, maybe 4 kilometres or 6 kilometres. They might only do it for 1 or 2 nights and then they'll come back. And then all this figure here shows you is that, so it's just the same as this one essentially, but it just breaks those down into roosting, which is the daytime. That's these purple splodges. This is where birds are roosting, mostly in Kelly Swamp and the wetlands where we catch them, but occasionally they'll hang out somewhere else. And then the green is where they're foraging. So that's the nighttime sites. Generally quite distinct. And we think that older birds go less distance to feed than younger birds. And then at a regional scale, so there's the ACT there. This is some of the regional movements, birds leaving Jerrabomberra wetlands and going into different parts of Canberra, including down here into the Alps for a bit. And then we had a couple of birds that did some big flights. We had this one bird that went to Nowra, about 200 kilometres, stayed there for about, I think, a week, did the same thing, day, night in there, and then it came back again. So they've got their strategies, these birds, and they're really interesting to see the ones that just hang out in their wetland and they do the same thing, and then the other ones that go for little wonders. And then here's those tracks. So 4 birds came back to the same spot the next year. And I was up in the first year that happened. I was actually up in Iron Range doing the bird banding up there, and we didn't really have much phone reception. I get this phone call. Laurie's gone, it's come back, it's come back. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, the birds come back from Japan. It's here. I've got it here on my phone. I can't show you. And she's apparently in a cafe, and the woman at the barista just had no idea what she was on about. But yeah, so the birds had come back the next year, and I guess that probably shouldn't be any surprise, but we put the tags on, got a season of data. We're very excited to see how they use the Canberra area, then sort of waved them goodbye and didn't really sort of expect them to come back again. And they just gave us such gold information, so 2 birds have bred in Hokkaido, in southern Hokkaido. And then 2 birds have gone up to Sakhalin, and this one's bred right in the southwest, the bottom of Sakhalin Island, and then this one's sort of, I don't know, part way up, not far from a spot that I visited when I was there some years ago. And again, as I was pointing out before, some of these birds are going through Japan to get up into their breeding grounds, and then some are just going straight across the ocean. This bird's staged here on the northwest coast of PNG rather than in the highlands. They're not all in the highlands. And then here's the staging sites in Queensland, and you can see there's a bunch of them in the Cape York, and then there's some here in sort of, I guess that's far north Queensland. I can't tell you exactly where those are because I can't remember. All coming out of Canberra. So that was like extraordinary to get those data. And because it's GPS data, it's really high resolution data. Like we can see exactly what patches of grass or fields they're using. I've been able to work out from the positions that 2 of the 4 birds that went up here, I don't think they've bred because their points are all over the place. So yeah, it's just amazing data that you get from these, and just equally amazing these birds came back. So this at the moment is our tag of choice, and the birds seem to carry them just fine. We haven't seen any issues. And then there was the radio tracking I was telling you about. It's kind of sad, we went to all this effort. We put all these tags on in Port Fairy and Canberra in the early years, and I had an honours student working on it. Glue the tags on and off you go with your little antenna looking for them. And we got some really good data out of Port Fairy, but they're utterly superseded now by these GPS tags. But the interesting thing, of course, from the radio tracking was that we've just seen exactly the same pattern re-establishing. So this is where we sort of got the first evidence that birds were roosting and feeding in totally different locations, and that when we focus on roost sites, daytime sites, we're missing half the story. So this is Port Fairy down in southwest Victoria. This is the Powling Street wetlands where the project began, and a nearby grassland block that used to be contiguous and has now got houses across half of it. So these are the spots we were catching the birds in, these 2 spots here. And then the Sandy Cove is an estuarine site where we're also catching the birds. And they were getting picked up during the day back at their wetlands where they'd been caught. And then at night time, we were picking them out here in these fields to the west of the town. These are, agricultural grazing fields, so they're used for livestock grazing. They're highly modified, they've got no vegetation on them at all. They're muddy. They've got a little bit of surface water. And all the birds are out there at night feeding. So obviously really great habitat for them at night time. All on private land, and perhaps no surprises, this area is earmarked for Port Fairy's growth area by the council for the next 50 years, and they want to put houses all over this. So we're going to be probably back in the court at some point, which is not a very exciting experience. How am I going for time? She's done this quicker than usual. We've been to Japan a couple of times. So we got some funding from the Australia-Japan Foundation to, initially it was around exchanging research knowledge and engagement, and not long after that, the Australian-Japan Foundation changed their funding rules and the word research disappeared out of there. But anyway, we got there and we spent some time at Lake Utenai in Hokkaido, near where they catch the snipe, doing some work with the Japanese, which was just an amazing experience. And that, really generous, lovely people. That was a little team that went that first year. And then we went back 2 years later under another fund, which was about exchanging knowledge through education. So we took a whole lot of kids. None of them, they're all teenagers now. They're all adults now. But at the time, they were all kids, barely teenagers. We took them over there from Canberra, so they were in the Young Rangers group, to Japan. And then we had these little workshops with Japanese parents and their children, learning about snipe in both languages. And then we went out and we helped do snipe surveys. And as I said, snipe are easy to survey there. Just stand on the side of a road and just count them flying around your head. And that was a really fantastic experience for the children, well, for all of us, to be fair. We ended up doing a whole bunch of surveys across Hokkaido after we finished the school engagement stuff, and I got to see some amazing snipe habitat as well as Hokkaido, which is very beautiful. And we went and spoke to some of the schools again and did some demos there with them. So it was a really great experience for everybody, and I think has established some lasting connections between the people in the two countries. And then in 2019, I got the opportunity to go to Russia because I'd been exchanging some information with a researcher there who lived in Yuzhno, the capital, and was pretty familiar with the snipe. And he used to say to me, I know what the Japanese are on about. Yeah, there's tons of snipe here. They're not declining. There's heaps of them. They're everywhere. And I was like, well, I don't know. That's not what the rest of the world's saying. He said, well, you go come here and have a look for yourself. And I'm like, well, okay, I will. So I went over there in May 2019 and we did this little tour through Sakhalin. It was about a 9-day tour. I flew into the capital and Pavel met me there. And then we drove up the west coast. And then we drove up through the centre up to Nogliki, which is it's about 50 degrees north, I suppose. And we did opportunistic surveys along the way. And I repeated the method the Japanese do, that they call meshes. So it's like a point count survey. You've got an area that's like I think it's like 100 by 100 meters. No, that can't be right. Maybe it's smaller than that. And you count for a set period of time and you count in the number of displaying males you see. And then you essentially take that number and multiply it by 2 to get an estimate of how many birds are there, because the males display and the females don't. We found most of the birds in these parts of the country because the timing was just a bit out, but the Parvels had birds through much of Sakhalin Island. And this bit in the centre here, so this is the old distribution map that Birdlife International, I think, still has on their website, showing not really much in the way of breeding in Russia. But the information I was getting from Pavel and then when I was there, it's like they're breeding much further north than that. And this area here in the centre is taiga, so it's deciduous conifers like larch, and there's birch, and it's quite thick through there, and they don't go into that thick forest at all. But anywhere else, it's like this. The edges of villages and things, you'll get snipe there. And so on the basis of that, we did a bit of an analysis of some historical data from Sakhalin plus some of the observational stuff. And we've found through that combined effort that there is definitely a range expansion going on. And the survey work Pavel's been doing has picked up the birds over the years, increasing as you go further north. So they're now actually up here on the Schmidt Peninsula. They turned up in about 2010, I think it was. And then they're also advancing up the Kuril chain here with these gaps where you've got this large forest. And we had quite large numbers. And so when we did the analysis, we actually came up with potentially quite a large population there. Like there could be 5,000 or 10,000 snipe just on Sakhalin Island. And if you think about the population estimate from Hokkaido being 35, then you sort of got to ask yourself for what's going on there. Does that mean that, people have asked me, does that mean they're shifting north? And I'm like, well, I don't know. There's certainly not, there's nothing going on Primori on the mainland. There's no changes in distribution there. So part of it could be land use change, opening up of habitat in Sakhalin. Some of it might be climate change. It's a bit hard to say how that would be affecting the species. And yet we've got this decline in Japan. So there's definitely something worthy of further exploration there to try and understand what's going on in those two countries. So just to sort of wind up, we've learnt so much in the last 10 years, and yet I just feel like the list of findings is still shorter than the list of to-dos on this project and unknowns. But, one of these things that appeared early in the project and has continued to reappear throughout the monitoring is these large congregations of snipe. And the early accounts suggested those were fairly uncommon and the species was widely distributed at low densities. And yet we're getting a lot of records of birds aggregating, often in small wetlands. Most of these, not surprisingly, in southeastern Australia, and those large numbers, as I call them, typically about 50 to 200 snipe. I've said we've identified 50 new sites that meets the EPBC Act threshold. That's way out of date. I need to update that slide. It's probably over 75 now. Some of those will go into the new Birdlife National Habitat Directory and some aren't in there yet. I guess the thing with with these thresholds is that they're only triggered when there's a land use change proposed, and agricultural activities are excluded. So, even though we can go, oh, well, we identify these sites and they're really important and that's great. It's like, unless someone goes, okay, well, I'm going to dig the wetland up or build a house on it, it's not really providing any protection to the sites. There's not really any mechanisms out there to protect those sites if they fall outside the Ramsar network or any of our other, like nationally important wetlands. They almost don't exist. So the EPBC Act doesn't really protect snipe populations at all. And I think this is a real issue for this species, is that they are falling outside protection areas. And then there's this lack of understanding or recognition, particularly around land managers and councils, about this species and their habitat requirements. And so time and time again, I'm seeing people going and developing land and, council just completely ignoring their obligations to monitor for this species. They just don't even know about it. And then we end up in the court disputing it. And I'm like, well, this is a vulnerable species under the Act, and it's a migratory species, and you've got a nationally significant population on your doorstep. You need to be doing your due diligence before you issue permits. So it's just a problem for this species that's not going away. To more happy things, we've got some really good data on migration now, and there is just so much information in it that I feel like I could spend the next 5 years pulling it all out. And Laurie's trying to do a bit of that now as part of her PhD, but I expect that we may get more migration data because we have some more tagging scheduled in the next couple of years, and hopefully we can dig into that a bit more. We've got a pretty good idea now where some of these staging sites are. We certainly know the regions that host staging birds. Probably one of the things we still don't know is exactly, what properties they're on and who manages those properties. And we've picked up this really strong daytime, nighttime movement pattern that is something that needs to be, again, thought about in planning and protection of the species. You can't just focus on daytime roost sites and think you've ticked the box, because you're missing half the story. And we're also we've noticed it particularly with the BHF transponders and one of the geolocators, that we have birds go through and birds stay. And, there's a bit of that going on with the GPS trackers too. And that fine scale data we're getting as well, birds just hang out in the same spot, wetland, and some, go and, go further afield, go exploring. And I guess if you know shorebirds, it's probably not a surprise, because shorebirds are typically quite site faithful, but there'll be birds that do roam around a bit more or don't return to the same site. And, it's usually related to age, but they're very hard to age this species. So without banding and flagging these birds, we don't know what their age is. We just have to sort of go, is it 1 or 1+? It's pretty much the best we can do. But it certainly looks like there's a fair bit of site fidelity in these birds. And that's just a sort of a bit of a visual, I suppose, of where some of these important staging areas are. So I've got my map, my national map I'm working on for where nationally important habitat is in relation to roost sites and the EPBC Act, planning. But, the other thing I'm really interested in was where those important staging sites, because you won't see any mention of that in the Act or in the significant impact guidelines, because they just don't know. And one of the things I find really interesting is that the Hunter region is both a staging site and a terminus site. And I suspect perhaps that's also the case with ACT to a lesser extent. I mean, we had birds come back and stay there the following season, whereas others disappeared. So you've sort of, I wonder what the transition zone is here between moving through and staying. And, it would be really nice to know, which birds decide to stay in the region and which ones go through and why. On the to-do list, tracking data, population. We have analysed the population genetic data, and it was not particularly insightful. So there's probably not much more to do there at the moment, except to say that the snipe in Port Fairy and the snipe in ACT are not the slightest bit genetically differentiated. So that was not very exciting, but I guess interesting to know. It suggests that they're mixing on the breeding grounds. We need to understand some characteristics and the tenure management of these stopover sites. So there's still a big bit of work to happen there. I've had review of snipe and woodcock, particularly, looking at their conservation and policy instruments and agreements to protect or not protect those species. That's been on my to-do list forever. I'm slowly working on a national map for Latham snipe wetlands. It is, ultimately, I'd like to get something like that into state and national tool sets, spatial tool sets for planning purposes. It's just a really slow process, because not only is it about mapping the sites we survey and we know, it's looking at where are all the other records, and can we, I guess, extrapolate what we've learnt to these spots where we see one-off records. What's the extent of those areas, and then can we extrapolate beyond that to areas where we haven't got records to work out what might be habitat. And that's something we're going to be starting to tackle a little bit in the next few months with a new project on renewable energy impacts on snipe. There's population. I haven't talked anything about really the highland population. There's clearly birds that use the highlands. That's been known for a long time. We don't have any understanding about how big that is, what the dynamics of that population is. People say to me, "Oh, are they going to be a threat from like wild horses?" Or I'm like, I don't know. So there's some big questions about those birds up in the highlands. I really want to develop and test a nighttime method for snipe, and I think we're sort of getting to the point where we might be able to try that, potentially with infrared or thermal cameras. Again, trying to get at this knowledge gap about what are they doing at nighttime, and how would you actually go out and measure that if you had to do an impact assessment. I really just want to go out and like catch swinhoes and Latham snipe in the overlap zone. This is a bit of a that one there's my retirement project. I'll get to it one day. And Papua New Guinea, I mean, what's going on there? I mean, it's clearly really, really important region for the species. We'd like to try and get in there and do some work in Papua New Guinea, Cape York, continue the national surveys, see if we can get at this the trends in the population. It might be on per population or per region basis rather than aggregating overall like they do with the Birdlife data, but we'll just see how that goes. And look, I just want to thank you all for listening. I hope I haven't gone over time. I wasn't really paying attention to the clock. I want to thank those of you that have contributed to the project, either one-off or ongoing, part of a massive effort to monitor this species. And there is absolutely no doubt this project would be impossible without volunteers. And we've got a lot of amazing people out there still helping, and I'm really grateful to those people. We've had little bits and pieces of funding over the years, mostly tiny little amounts of money to pay for some tags or a trip to Japan. And then a lot of support from a range of organisations to help with catching, international visits, analysis, developing tracking methods and attachment for snipe. We did have a little, which those of you on the email list will have seen, we had a little documentary done about the snipe project, which was fabulous. It was entered into the Southern New South Wales Film Festival. I can't remember what it was called last year. So it was we went to this film festival to watch this snipe documentary. It didn't win in its category, sadly. And of course, I do need to acknowledge that the university have supported me through this project, even when I haven't been bringing in any money for it. So I'm very grateful to my boss, and I'm really grateful to you all listening. Thank you.